emergency for the first time in about
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 1445.PR2622, certificate number 44448, the worst poet in history.
Darkle crunkles the saddest tune, I flirtling on a sorry moon. I'll wail and fork, hear Bork's boom, the desolate crunk of Nurkles.
You like British comedy.
It's kind of the main thing about me. I'm a little wacky that way. Love my red dwarf. I love my Blackadder.
Yes.
All kinds of colors.
Faulty Towers.
You can't beat it.
Well, how would you describe the difference, the primary difference between British and American comedic sensibilities?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's become fuzzier over time. But, you know, the lightning bolt of Monty Python's Flying Circus in 69 or 70 or whenever that first aired, I mean, it was immediately a hit all over the world. And there were lookalikes. Like, I think the Pythons lost some comedy competition to an Austrian Monty Python ripoff tribute band, basically. And at that time, the contrast was pretty stark. You know, some of the Pythons were roped into doing kind of laugh-in type shows on American TV, but nobody on this side of the Atlantic was doing, that kind of absurdity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sketches that just are funny because they don't make sense. Maybe pushing an idea that's just strange until it becomes funny instead of just an idea that can immediately be apprehended as funny. There's definitely an element of fourth wall breaking in that kind of comedy. You know, the sketch could comment on itself. The characters could hold up little signs saying, I'm an insurance agent or whatever. You weren't going to see that on Laugh-In or whatever other sketch comedy there was in 1968 in the U.S. And then there's just something about, I think for us, for a lot of American Teaboo types who kind of fetishize the culture, there's just something about the accents and the vestige of the class system and the kind of sense of authority and decorum that comes with all that culture.
Yeah.
That kind of juxtaposed with the silliness just seems delightful in a way that would seem precious if they were Americans trying to do the silly walk sketch, you know,
right.
Like because we're seeing what we take to be very dignified, educated Oxbridge types doing it. That's much funnier than if, you know, Artie Johnson and Ruth Buzzy were doing it.
There's a quaintness to it, but there's also a kind of pathos to British comedy that's almost absent in American comedy, in that Britons and you know the Commonwealth comedic sensibility loves like a loser. American comedians, Stephen Fry very famously said, like American comedy is all about winning.
Yeah.
The goofball, the outsider who raises his eyebrow and devastates everyone in the room. You know, the American comedian gets over.
even the stand-up is very cocky, and he's got the last word on all the stuff he's observing.
Right. Whereas the British comedic sensibility is much more about these functionaries, these gray suit types, the people that try and fail, the frustration of going into a shop and not being able to get what you want.
How many Python sketches are just a customer walks into a shop, a man walks into a lawyer or accountant's office?
Somebody, yeah, exactly. You're dealing with a government functionary. There's some confusion about the language. You can't. You get your paperwork wrong, and that's kind of it pervades when you think about English comedy and all of the best stuff. It kind of once Stephen Fry made me aware of it, I realized, oh wow, this really reverberates. It's why the two styles are so different, so markedly different, and how you can enjoy both, but differentiate between them so much. I mean, think about the Goon Show. You think about all the classics.
That's why we've been trying for decades to engineer our own Mr. Bean, and we've been unable to
do it.
All of our American Beans have failed.
And I think it's a broad characterization of Americans in general, right? And it's one of the reasons that it's another kind of thing that makes us ridiculous to people around the world.
I mean, that's why it seems so appealing to hear Stephen Fry say it, because it meshes with our idea of Americans as cowboy booted,
right?
Yokels trampling all over the world.
And Stephen Fry is nice in that he expresses admiration for it because he's gentle. He's not an English satirist who's going to make Americans, who's going to, pillory us or shame us to death.
Well, they can both be funny.
Yeah.
Stephen Fry knows there are funny British comics and there are funny American comics.
And I think it's maybe why British comedy seems a little bit more elevated to us, even low humor there, because just the idea of celebrating someone who's frustrated by a bureaucracy, that wouldn't be considered low humor in the United States, right? Low humor here is just throwing turd balls at one another. And
the ultimate British comedy man fights bureaucracy icon is, I guess, Terry Gilliam's Brazil, and he was the only American Python. He must have been infected.
He did. He got soaked. He was soaking in it. The palm olive of British comedy.
British humiliation. You're soaking in it.
But this goes way back in British culture, and I think a lot of people, and even maybe Stephen Fry, attribute that the humiliation that's in the British sense of humor to the kind of end of the colonial period, the loss of the great empire, the feeling of low self-esteem or insecurity that came from being sort of once great and now
the generation that's in the ruins of it.
Yeah,
I wonder if there's going to be some analog in millennial or Gen Z,
the post-American era.
Yeah, the pathos of living in a dying empire. I mean, it's producing a lot of anxiety and addiction, but.
Right now, there's a lot of
hilarious YouTubers.
It's producing a lot of angry comedy right now. There's not very much that's like gentle.
That's right. It's just people lashing out on social media.
But when you look at UK culture, going back 18th and 19th century, you see this tendency, the lovable idiot, the sort of like laughable fool. It's present in English literature and culture, and I mean you can trace it back to the origin story, right? It's really America is the anomaly.
We have the shrewd Yankee.
That's right.
I'm trying to think what the kind of
what the wellspring of it.
Yeah, what are your Chaucerian or Shakespearean kind of
I thought this too, and
fools.
I couldn't find the precise analog, and I think it may be
it's Dickensian for sure.
Yeah, but that's the
Mr.
thing.
Pickwick and all these kinds of
it may be a product of the Victorian era and the fact that that there are so many opportunities for there to be fish out of water as you move from the bucolic where the social order is really clear and into a world where capitalism has sort of topsy-turvied the social order. You have all these people that started, that are bumpkins that are suddenly wearing high collars and are expected to perform in an industrial or in an urban context. But
right, maybe Restoration comedy could do that with city versus country or something, but it wasn't really getting upended yet.
Yeah,
you could contrast it, but there wasn't mobility.
The bumpkin is funny, but it's really the class distinction. It's only funny to, you can only mock the manners. Those are comedies of manners, right? But when you get into an urban context and you are you're able then to mock people whose change in station, it creates kind of these
people who have risen above their capabilities.
Yeah, or in a world, particularly in the 19th century in the UK, where that kind of post-Enlightenment sense that an intellectual life, an urban intellectual life, somehow transcended class a little bit.
Yeah.
You could be brilliant. It also opened the opportunity for so many people to believe that they were inspired or brilliant. It was a way to transcend your social strata, and that also opened up the opportunity for there to be a lot of fools.
An awful lot of Monty Python poking at fools. It's there's some pomposity. They're upper class twits. Sometimes they're expressly called upper class twits. And even though I'm sure the Pythons had good Oxford educations, I'm sure they were. I don't know. They come from upper middle class homes. I would assume.
Yeah, they were Oxford and Cambridge both.
But they enjoy the kind of nattering, silly, almost inbred, exaggerated idea of a frivolous upper class person with nothing to say and nothing between their ears.
Yeah, when you think about those universities prior to the 19th century, there wouldn't really have been much opportunity for a brilliant son of a farmer to through merit attend Oxford. So there wouldn't have been the idea that going there meant that you were I suppose you needed to be one of the smarter members of the upper class to pursue a university education. But by the 20th century, the idea that wealth and privilege and Oxford conveyed intellectual status, or that you could be an idiotic but pompous. Well, wait a minute. I'm pretty far afield here because, of course, there have always been dim-witted but pompous aristocrats.
Yeah, I'm sure that's where it. And there must have been descendants of that into the 20th century. That must have been a type of person they knew at Oxford or Cambridge, right?
Well,
or saw at parties.
Still the case, right?
Who's in the House of Lords today?
Exactly. Now the House of Lords is different than constituted differently than it was in 1960 or 68. Right,
but it's easy to find even the royal family saying just silly things that show they don't get outside their bubble much.
In the literary life in the United Kingdom in the 19th century, we had passed through the Enlightenment. There was a reaction to the Enlightenment that took the form in the early part of the 19th century of the Romantic poets, the Romantic era, where there was, and we've talked about it several times on Omnibus, the reintroduction of nature and the ephemeral into
reliability of emotion over the cold hard facts of their Enlightenment predecessors,
and the era of the Coleridge and the Keats and the Shelleys, the Romantic poet as a tragic figure.
And that's a world they write about that has mysteries in it. The Enlightenment thinkers wanted to solve all those mysteries and codify them out of existence. But the Romantics like a spooky ruin or a dappled glade, where that's where Gothic novels come from.
Sure, there are sprites in the.
It's way better.
The froggy marshes.
It's way better. Who would you rather read poetry by? One of these guys or Alexander Pope.
But I think it's hard for us through histories, through the great misty fogs of history, to imagine what that would have felt like to the working classes, right? There's we have Dickens and a lot of writers, contemporary writers, kind of showing us the working class through that lens, through the lens of the observer. But as the Romantic era sort of trended into the Victorian era, the role of the poet in public life in the streets of Edinburgh would have still been, the poet would have been a kind of rock star of the time, and the effect of it would have not been limited to the upper classes, right? Poetry is the barrier to entry of poetry is pretty low.
It's short.
That's right. And really there are a lot of different forms, and like any literary form, you can feel inspiration but not really have that inspiration conveyed to the page quite accurately.
It can seem difficult to us today because we're reading slightly antiquated language or use of meter and rhyme that's unfamiliar to us today. And certainly our future listeners will think the same thing about whatever poetry is like in the 21st century. Even the stuff we think is readable, they will not. But poetry was a mass art, Alfred Lord Tennyson was poet laureate for decades and was called upon to write stirring things about the empire.
Right.
So everybody would love to read The Charge of the Light Brigade, and people would learn to recite these things in grade school. So you could go your whole life reciting The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck or whatever, some kind of patriotic thing. And it wasn't fussy elitist high art. Everybody you knew about these great inspiring moments told in verse.
And that goes all the way back to the Greeks, right? I mean, the stories of Western literature were all poems, ultimately.
Easier to remember if you're Homer.
Nowadays, there's an Amanda Gorman every once in a blue moon who steps out and makes poetry relevant again, and all of a sudden there's a renewed interest in it. I came up in a time when the beat poets, the Bukowskis
young
were
people
still
all went through a phase. Young men actually all went through a phase of that.
Right. Where poetry and drunkenness kind of overlapped.
The women were smarter and they were reading Mary Oliver or something.
But in the late 19th century in industrial Britain, poets were there were poets of all classes, and working class poets would often kind of stand out in the street with handbills, writing a poem and selling it for a couple of pennies as a way of making a living. Poetry was and particularly like heroic poems, epic poems. It was most of those working class poets, of course, their work didn't survive to the modern age, primarily because the gatekeepers were all upper class twits, or it was rare for a working class poet to be acknowledged as truly gifted.
They didn't even have publishers, right? Pretty much, you would go outside and come back with a hot dog and a couple of poems,
a hot dog wrapped in a poem,
a hot dog wrapped in a sonnet.
Yeah, and you would poets would have sort of benefactors, local people that admired their poetry and maybe supported them a little bit, or combined their pamphlets into larger pamphlets. But during this period, it was kind of if you were a reverend or a public figure, having a sideline writing poetry was not that unusual and was kind of almost
you could send it into some publication, right? And they would print. Our correspondent J.W. from Sussex has sent us another one of his works about the fields.
That's exactly
in
right.
May.
And in Scotland, one of the sort of benefactors or champions, I guess, of working class poets was a reverend by the name of George Gilfillan, and he was himself a poet who was I think, regarded by the intelligentsia of his era as not a very good poet. He worked for 30 years composing an epic poem called Night. And when it finally was published in its entirety, was sort of reviewed as like gibberish.
Poets have been trying to write about night for centuries,
I know.
But this guy's finally going to nail it. He's got the take on night.
It's very
last.
elusive. I think it had, his poem had 10 acts and never really, it didn't coalesce. But Gil Fillan was a champion of other working class poets, and he was always sort of, trying to shine a light on the fact that all these mill workers in Scotland had their there were a great number of them kind of, like amateur, as you say, sending in poems to the local newspaper. And
this is a very progressive point of view for some of these social reformers, right? That even the common working man among us produces, unnoticed thinkers and diamonds in the rough.
Right. Right. It was progressive, and also, it coincided a lot with, because what's the difference really between a poem and a sermon? In the
it's punctuation.
Yeah, that's right. And often, I mean, this was an era where temperance was a major topic, suffrage, and these were all issues that if you found a hogshead to stand on and give a speech, why not also make that speech a poem?
They didn't have apple crates?
They had apple crates.
On the continent, they had apple crates, but the British were having to balance on hogshead. It's like those things in PE you kind of have to wiggle on back and forth because the hogshead just won't stay upright.
Well, there's the actual hogshead.
You're talking about like a barrel that holds a hogshead.
But
or
I
something.
love the picture of someone standing
just
on a
trying to balance. Like he's got a foot on each ear,
chopped off head.
He's like surfing a little bit at Hyde Park Corner.
This was also the era of big industrial projects. Big infrastructural development. This was the steam locomotive, the big factory, and so these topics became popular topics for epic poems. They weren't the upper class was still writing about bucolic nature and about great cavalry charges. Is it cavalry or cavalry? I always get that wrong.
What do you think?
Cavalry.
Correct.
Yay, cavalry charges. But the mill workers had really the mill to write about.
Trouble down the mill.
That's right.
Or the mine, or whatever.
And during this period, the topic of our story, a Scotsman by the name of William McGonagall, who arguably was an Irishman, but they
didn't have 23andMe?
He claimed to have, well, his parents were both Irish and born in Ireland, but he claimed to have been born in Scotland, but there's some dispute about whether
Is that something that you would claim you were born after emigration to make yourself
there was a
legitimate anchor baby type?
Yeah, there was the Poor Act was passed in sort of this era, and if you'd been born in Scotland, you would have been treated better than a poor person born in Ireland.
Not by me.
And that's probably
not
still
by me,
true.
I gotta say. I would treat them all with the dignity that they deserve.
Sure,
as
but
children of God.
You're on record as being the woke.
That's true.
Ken Jennings
and this is
woke.
the main way it manifests itself, by treating Scottish and Irish people the same as God intended.
But McGonagall was a mill worker, a weaver, and worked an entire career in the mills as actually like a hand weaver. Not he was old enough that he could still use a loom that wasn't like the machine loom of the young people. It wasn't like
they've got a room of oldsters still using the old stuff.
Yeah, because
retired
there were people. I mean, it was still skilled labor if you were doing detail work or whatever. And
right.
he worked until he was in his late 40s at a mill. He was a Presbyterian, a devout man, a teetotaler. He had 7 kids. Just in general, kind of a upstanding working class guy. And then in his middle age had and he was a self-taught guy who had kind of read enough Shakespeare and sort of entertained the other fellows at the mill by orating not reading aloud, but from memory, doing bits of the sonnets and
recitations and stuff.
And this was the type of thing, I guess, that passed the time at the mill. He was considered as a fairly self-serious character.
He was the first podcaster, basically.
But over the sound, rather than the sound of my daughter running around upstairs dropping what feel like platters of ingots on the floor.
How are her Barbie dolls like 60 pounds?
I have no idea.
weights?
I have no idea how she manages to sound like a train.
Fun with hogsheads.
But rather than that, he needed to shout his sonnets over the sound of the factory looms.
Would you listen to a podcast that was just two guys talking, but they're just having to yell over the sound of the factory where they work?
Would I? I feel like the sound of screaming in my own head is what keeps me from listening to podcasts.
Or what if it's like a pulsing club beat, and you and I are just like, so the romantic period,
or a pulsing club beat, but through the wall.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can't really discern.
We do the podcast in the bathroom, of course. We're not going to do it out on the floor.
I would not listen to that, but I don't listen to any podcasts, even ASMR ones, even ones recorded in completely silent bunkers, deep under the surface of Normandy Park.
I guess the thing about a mill would be if you could turn down the speakers and just enjoy it as an ASMR podcast. Just enjoy the looms doing their looming. Just fall asleep to that. You don't need two people talking about Presbyterians.
Well, McGonagall was, I think, for most of his life, was content to throw that shuttlecock back and forth.
Working class hero, something to be.
But then he was struck by the lightning of inspiration. The voice of God appeared in his ear and said, "Write. You must write."
How old? He's in his late 40s?
Yeah, he's what we would call a middle-aged person, although probably as a factory worker nearing the end of his life. At the time,
that was end of life crisis.
And so he did. He began to write. He began to write. And his first poem was a poem that he submitted to the newspaper in praise of a poem by George Gilfillan, the Reverend.
I see. Who is also an Edinburgh figure?
That's right.
I see.
And
so if you liked a poet back then, you could just write a poem about him.
They live in Dundee, so this is that little bit north of Edinburgh in Scotland on the coast there by the
it's one of the bigger and the biggest port city, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, it's on the Firth of Tay, a big body of water, and a big port. Also, Dundee, in my experience, has so many traffic circles. Like, they try to slow the traffic down through there, and you're just like, another traffic circle. Oh, here I am at another. Like, just let the road go through, right?
Maybe he should write a poem about that.
That's a kind of, I was giving you a little bit of a glimpse.
The Tay Roundabout by
all the roundabouts.
William McGonagall.
Freaking Dundee. So his first poem is in praise of George Gilfillan, and
it's funny. He's a fan. He's a poetry fan, and he's like, now's the time. It's finally filled my soul, and I have something to say.
And the Reverend is looking for working class poets, and so they become kind of a reciprocal admiration society.
Do you think that's why he wrote about this guy? He's buttering him up a little bit, buttering his scone, as they say in Scotland.
Well, as we'll see, he's not a particularly self-reflective person, and one does feel he's later parodied by Monty Python. A century later, the Pythons. By this point, McGonagall has become a figure in English history or English literature.
Yeah. And
the Pythons actually have a sketch of a poet by the name of Ewan McGonagall.
I know this sketch.
And all of his poems are just like, lend me a fiver. There isn't quite that sense of him being so nakedly self-interested. I believe, and I think
he's bearing his soul.
His fans do believe that he is completely earnest, maybe utterly earnest in his desire to write poetry, and I feel like he probably was rushing to the defense of some sort of sneering commentary on the Reverend's poems, because there was from the upper class a very dismissive tone And that included the publishers of the newspaper, a very dismissive tone toward a lot of this poetry. McGonagall's second poem was it began a long relationship that he had with the Firth of Tay, and in particular with the sort of one of the wonders of the age, the railway bridge over the Firth of Tay. Over the bay of
when a man and a local Firth love each other very much. So this is his muse, the progress of steam power over the Firth.
Yeah. So his second poem is an ode to the bridge, which at the time was the longest railroad bridge in the world, maybe the longest bridge in the world. A triumph of Victorian design, a bridge that was engineered in such a way that it marveled the Victorians because it seemed to be made of gossamer. It was so less a steel bridge.
It wasn't chunky.
It wasn't chunky, and it amazed them that it could even stand. McGonagall, as you will see, and I'll read you a little bit of a few of his poems.
Yeah, I'm hoping we get to hear some.
He understood that poems needed to rhyme, and beyond that, not much else about poetry. He tried to evoke the excitement and mystery of the world as he encountered it, and his poems were, I think, right away received with a lot of, let's say, good cheer by the people who encountered them.
Oh, so they're not laughing with him?
They're not really laughing with him. So here's a little bit from the Railway Bridge of the Silvery Tay. Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay, with your numerous arches and pillars in so grand array.
Tay's easy to rhyme.
And your central girders, which seem to the eye to be almost towering to the sky. The greatest wonder of the day, and a great beautification to the River Tay. Most beautiful to be seen, nearby Dundee and the Magdalen Green. Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay, that has caused the Emperor of Brazil to leave his home far away.
Is that true?
The Emperor of Brazil did come to visit the bridge of the Silvery Tay.
Imagine being all the way, you're at home in Brazil and you're like,
I got to see this.
That sounds so good.
And so, there is a reportage about this poem. It's not full of lies. Anyway, it's caused the Emperor of Brazil to leave his home far away, incognito in his dress, and view thee ere he passed along en route to Inverness.
Wait, the Emperor of Brazil was just like a little touch of Harry in the night. He's walking around Dundee in disguise, just getting the vibe of the bridge.
I think he was on a train, probably. The Queen Victoria did not come to the christening of the bridge, the opening of the bridge, although invited, but she did pass over the bridge on her way from Balmoral, and
that counts.
And she wrote about it in her journal. Wow, this amazing bridge! So it was a very popular topic conversation. He published this poem via pamphlet, and sent it to the newspaper, and it was complimented by the newspaper, by the editor of the paper of record, which, God, what was it called?
The Dundee Dispatch.
Yeah, the Dundee Dispatch.
The Dundee, I don't know.
The Dundee
Picayune Journal.
It was given a tongue-in-cheek compliment.
Oh, I see. So they're having a little fun.
They're having a little fun, like, wow, check out this poem. The author is too modest in submitting it to our lowly paper, but McGonagall seems throughout his career to be singularly immune to irony or sarcasm, and he took the tongue-in-cheek compliment literally and believed that it was an endorsement of his work. At which point he realized that he needed to submit his, or he needed a patron, and so he submitted his works to Queen Victoria, mailed them in to the office of the Queen.
That seems a little ambitious.
And received a very polite letter from the Queen's office thanking him for his submission.
Does the palace just send those to everyone?
Yeah, I believe there's someone at the palace who just
thank you for writing Her Majesty.
Thank you for writing Her Majesty. Keep up the good work. And McGonagall took that to be an endorsement from Victoria.
I like that he's such a guileless guy that, you know, he'll take anything as encouragement because he just loves the craft.
He loved her endorsement so much that he walked from Dundee to Balmoral over hill and dale, a journey of 60 plus miles, you know, like sleeping out under the stars, and appeared at the gate claiming to be the Queen's poet and ready to entertain her, ready for an audience.
Does this enter into the realm of delusion then? A lot of people would get that note and think, that's so nice, but they wouldn't think they could just wander into Balmoral.
Well, so this is the challenge in interpreting the experience of not just McGonagall's experience, but his role in 19th and 20th century English culture. And I know I keep saying English, British, UK. Obviously, he's a Scottish poet.
He's not English.
And so this is the problem with being an American and feeling like even though we all know what those words are not indistinguishable, we just can't help ourselves.
We don't honestly care as much as they do.
Well, because what he did, what happened is he became a figure of fun in England, not just in Britain, but specifically in the 20th century. He became a figure of fun in England
in his lifetime, or
no? Well, yes, also in his lifetime, and I'll
that's
get
a bummer
to that in a second.
if people are laughing at him in the big city.
Well, it's a bummer unless you are William McGonagall and are immune to mockery. When he appeared at the Queen's Gate, you know, the guards mocked him and sent him away. They said, Tennyson is the Queen's poet and you are not. But he wasn't dissuaded. And then a singular event really thrust him to the fore, which was that the railway bridge over the Silvery Tay collapsed in a giant disaster where a train going over the bridge fell into the water, killing 75 people. And
well, that's going to be hard on a lot of people, but maybe him most of all.
Well,
it seems like he really liked that bridge.
One would think, unless you used it as inspiration to write a new poem, the Tay Bridge Disaster poem.
Oh, he's like the Gordon Lightfoot of Dundee.
That's right. And so he wrote an epic poem about it. I'll read a little bit of it to you. Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay. Alas, I am very sorry to say that 90 lives have been taken away, although it was only 75.
75 didn't scan.
It could have been that 75 lives have been taken away. It actually kind of has a little bit of a swing to it. But on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. And on it goes, recounting the story of the train trip and the crash. And his Tay Bridge Disaster poem, when published, is now widely regarded as the worst poem anyone has ever read.
I mean, I can see what they're getting at. I mean, addressing the bridge is kind of funny.
Yeah.
You know, going back to kind of the same easy rhymes. You know, there's
it's really the same poem over and over.
Yeah, and really having nothing to say about the bridge. Just thinking that you could describe the bridge to the bridge, and that's a poem. The bridge knows what its girders look like. You don't have to tell it.
Yeah, I mean...
Like Keats had a take on the urn, and Shelley had a take on the nightingale.
This is now several stanzas into the poem where the action happens.
Ooh.
So the train moved slowly along the Bridge of Tay. This was after describing like the passengers and the trip so far.
Their luggage.
Until it was about midway. Then the central girders with a crash gave way. So he really paints the scene. And down went the train and passengers into the Tay.
Does every line end with the same rhyme?
No, but in this stanza, a lot of them do. The storm fiend did loudly bray because 90 lives had been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. So there's a Dr. Seussian.
Yeah, it seems like he's not even thinking about what the next line is going to be. You know, he creates a new rhyme and then he's like, "Oh, what rhymes with 9?"
Yep.
Just gotta
get back to it.
Gotta keep hammering away.
So now he becomes a figure of fun, and people start to hire him to read poems aloud at parties and events as a comedic figure.
Well, I don't like this.
And he doesn't get it. He doesn't know that he's being mocked because he's a very, very serious, devout man. And
doesn't he have friends? Can't somebody pull him aside and say, "Hey, Bill"?
Well, he's convinced by his letter from Victoria, by, if you said, "Hey, they don't like your poem, they're actually teasing you," he would point to the Reverend Gilfillan, and the praise that he'd received, all tongue in cheek, and you couldn't kind of dislodge him from the idea. Well, because he was given this gift from God, he was touched,
I guess.
And so all the people that were visibly mocking him, he could dismiss as people who didn't understand.
And nobody ever dumps pig blood on him at the party, or.
Well, in fact, that does begin to happen. Oh. He's, as a working class person, he is not, his poetry is not being funded by his trust fund. And having quit the mill, he's now dependent on the few sort of shillings that get thrown his way by patrons and by people buying his leaflets. And so a lot of this patronage, even though it's at his expense, it does generate income for him. And at a certain point, he begins to actually perform as part of a circus act, where he's specifically like on stage and being pelted with vegetables by a rowdy sort of working class audience as a circus act, and being paid for it on the regular, and seems immune to it as a humiliating experience.
It's not ridicule to him
because he feels like he's being paid for his poetry and he's on stage like communicating.
I mean, honestly, a lot of poets today might take that.
Yeah, for sure. It got so rowdy, though. His performances at the circus got so rowdy that that the city shut it down and closed down his act.
Which doesn't happen at poetry readings much.
No.
You don't get a lot of visits from the fire marshals.
Well, not now, but if I feel like if I read my poetry aloud, that it would inspire a riot. It would probably be closer to a sex riot.
It'd be a different kind of riot.
Yeah. But yeah, he was making 15 shillings a night at the circus and was banned. Now the problem with this, of course, is that in very recent years, because his poetry has been reassessed and reassessed several times in the intervening century and a half.
Is anybody like, actually, this was fine? We were classist as hell.
No, the poetry is bad, but what has happened is in very recent years, the suggestion that he was on the spectrum, and that as a person who became kind of obsessed and focused on his inspiration and the poetry and oblivious to the social cues of people telling him that, or communicating with him that his work was bad.
The fact that he started out as a very obsessive fan of a different poet makes me think that holds. We see that a lot in, anybody knows that the most obsessed fan of everything, the guy who has his own projects and binders at home, he or she is, probably thinking a little differently than the rest of us.
And there are lots of working class poets at the time that are talking about their experience as workers. One of them, a woman by the name of Ellen Johnston, who was, I think all contemporary accounts were that she was a very difficult person to like, someone who was
not socially
pretty
adept.
Yeah, pretty friendless, but wrote poems about her time working in the mills and published them in the newspaper, submitted them to the newspaper under the nom de plume, The Factory Girl. Also celebrated by Reverend Gilfillan, and she's had her work. And she was also ridiculed in her time and largely forgotten until recently. She's been rehabilitated because she's one of the few authentic voices of a working class woman reporting her experiences in its time. Nobody else's account survived. Right. So although maybe not celebrated now as a poet, she is rehabilitated as an authentic voice,
a witness or an artifact.
Right.
Yeah.
McGonagall continued to write. He traveled to London seeking his fame, and became kind of the source of he became rather the victim of some upper class pranks. At one point, he got a letter purportedly from the King of Burma, saying that he'd experienced, the King of Burma had delighted in his poem so much that he had knighted him Sir Topaz, Knight of the White Elephant of Burma. And McGonagall took this to be authentic, and forever after,
he called himself
William or Sir William Topaz McGonagall,
just because of
the Knight of the White Elephant,
some dissolute, rich bottle conjurer types making fun of him after dinner.
Yeah, and this happened to him a lot.
That happened to him a lot. He had multiple fake knighthoods.
And so, one of the upper class professors and poets, because almost everybody in this story is also a poet. But one of the upper class poets, W.E. Aytoun, W.E. Aytoun.
Is it spelled weird, or are you just doing a weird voice? I can't even tell.
Aytoun, and it's a Scot. He's a Scot, so Aytoun, who's a professor at Edinburgh.
Yeah, iTunes was named after him.
iTunes. He coins the terms the spasmodic poets to describe all of these poets who are writing this very sort of brute, passionate,
artless
kind of the poem comes to them and they just sort of spurt it out. He's very dismissive and of McGonagall in particular, but McGonagall keeps writing and he is a very progressive. He's a teetotaler, as I say, but also
he's reform-minded.
He writes. Here's a little bit from his poem about women's suffrage called "Women's Suffrage." Fellow men, why should the lords try to despise and prohibit women from having the benefit of the parliamentary franchise? When they pay the same taxes as you and me, I consider they ought to have the same liberty. And I consider if they are not allowed the same liberty from taxation, every one of them should be set free. And if they are not, it is really very unfair, and an act of injustice I most solemnly declare.
He does seem to think that just saying something is as good as writing a poem.
Yeah, as long as it rhymes at the end.
I think he might be hurting the cause here.
Women, farmers, have no protection as the law now stands, and many of them have lost their property and lands, and have been turned out of their beautiful farms by the unjust laws of the land and the sheriff's alarms. So,
yeah, if I were a suffragette, I might try to get him to write for the other side.
Yeah, well, the arguments for women's suffrage, I think at the time you took every supporter you could get, and McGonagall had become somewhat famous in his time because he was so universally mocked that he was also celebrated. Wealthy benefactors supported him.
It still happens today.
Yeah, as a gag.
You see plenty of people who are bragging about how much they get made fun of on social media because, they're talking about me.
His poems were collected in a book called The Poetic Gems, which and published by, again, a sort of like a well-to-do fan. And I think it was fashionable to say that you were a fan of McGonagall in this like
you're in the know.
Yeah, like this TV show is so bad it's good.
Hate watching.
But sadly, he died. He died in poverty because all of this, you can sell only so many copies of Poetic Gems to
ironic poetry
lovers. He died in poverty. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and sort of would have been an artifact of his era, in the same way that although when Reverend Gilfillan died, he was very much like a public figure in his time. There were thousands of people attended his funeral. We would not know about him today if not through his connection to this story.
That's funny.
But it was really Spike Milligan in the 1950s,
the Goon Show comedian,
who resurrected this character, William McGonagall, the world's worst poet, and made him a character played alternately by himself and Peter Sellers on the Goon Show. He was called William McGonagall. And they did this, the terrible poet who wasn't aware that he was terrible. And through the Goon Show, he became a kind of, again, like the sort of lovable loser British character, still really mocked, and through that into Python. There's actually a character in Harry Potter.
McGonagall?
McGonagall, named after McGonagall. But it was through this then that this retroactive appreciation of the idea, the caricature, that McGonagall began to have a second life as an English literary figure.
Is he back in print?
So he's never been out of print.
Oh, wow.
Because there was always a little, sort of surviving interest in these hilariously bad poems. But he's now, throughout the second half of the 20th century and until now, became increasingly a celebrated figure. There's now a plaque where once he was sort of buried in a potter's grave, celebrating him and celebrating him in sort of a style of his own verse.
Nice. Oh, William McGonagall, here we see thee lie beneath the Scottish clouds and sky.
His gravestone now, which was only installed in 1999, reads William McGonagall, poet and tragedian.
I feel like the tragedy might have been enacted by him, not written down.
I am, your gracious majesty, ever faithful to thee, William McGonagall, the poor poet that lives in Dundee.
So it's addressed to Queen Victoria?
It is.
I've never seen a gravestone that talks to a different gravestone hundreds of miles away.
And part of it, I think, part of what makes him seem heroic and tragic is all these many hours that he spent reciting his poems in pubs, often reciting like abstinence poems in pubs and having beer thrown on him.
He must be beloved, yeah.
And feeling that he was on the right side of history. But because of this love for him, that's why people remember George Gilfillan and most of the spasmodic poets, because of this caricature. It's why Ellen Johnston has made it now into as a reporting working class woman of the 19th century. It's through this connection to the Queen's poet.
It would be like if people only remembered, basketball through the Harlem Globetrotters or something like that, right?
As recently in the last 10 years, a folio of 30 odd of his poems actually sold at auction for £6,500.
This whole story is teaching me that it was probably very hard to be aneurotypical back then. Today we can take our gifted high functioning oddballs and throw them at a difficult computer algorithm or something, and they just love it. They'll just have weird hobbies. But back then he had a boring mill job, and he's got an unusual mind that's just spinning away, and no opportunities for somebody of his class. So he wrote Doggerel in the paper. Good for him. Yeah,
you wonder. I mean, and this brings us back to the question of like American comedy. American comedy punches down traditionally in a lot of ways, like its worst impulses.
Yeah.
But the comedian is always in on the joke. The comedian is never. The comedian doth not mock himself.
But Mr. Bean doesn't know he's doing something very silly.
That's right. And at a certain point, like how many of the great British comedic heroes are actually neuroatypical? If you think about even Basil Fawlty, like does he not suffer from a malady?
Well, if we were a tiny island like they were, we'd probably have a lot of these genetic issues too. And that concludes The Worst Poet in History. Entry 1445.PR2622. Certificate number 444444444444448 in the omnibus. Futurelings, as you may know, we were products of our time here at the Omnibus Project. We kept track of our comings and goings on social media at Omnibus Project. Twitter, on Facebook, we were well represented by the Futurelings, some contemporary listeners. You can search for them there, or on Reddit or Discord, or wherever weird community building happens today on the internet. I was at Ken Jennings on some of these platforms. You could find John on his Patreon. Jointly, we had Omnibus's own Patreon. The show was really only kept going by the donations of generous and devoted listeners. At patreon.com/omnibusproject, you can learn more about the perks and advantages available to those who donate. We received email at theomnibusproject@gmail.com, which helped us out with the monthly addenda shows we now put together. We received postal mail through the surprisingly affordable and efficient miracle of the United States Postal Service at P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington 98155. Let's see, what do we have here? You received, this looks like it's...
Is this another one that's addressed just to me? I hope it's chocolate bars.
There's actually 2 books, so they may be... this is all well labeled. Nick and Rex from the Lane Motor Museum in Nashville, Tennessee. Open Thursday to Monday, 10 to 5. Mm-hmm. If those hours are too early for Mr. Roderick, attached are our business cards. Owned. They're open till 5. These guys think you're
That
not
is
out of bed till 5.
That is not late enough. A museum should be open till 8.
Oh, right. That's a point you've often made.
Yes.
That museums close right around the time people are getting off work. We hear. No, he sent us a couple of books, possibly from their gift shop.
What are they?
You got a collection of their catalog, a hardcover
like that.
Lane Motor Museum.
Oh, I like that. Look
with
at
the
that.
cool, odd
Those are cool.
automobiles and automobile adjacent vehicles.
That's cool. That's a
that they
very nice
have.
coffee table book. What did you get?
Road Trip, a practical manual, inspiration and expert advice for planning and driving road trips around the world, including 50 suggested routes, including international driving routes to get my kids off of Skyrim. That's nice.
You have been, you've been on some road trips, I know.
I was on a road trip as recently as this weekend, if Eugene, Oregon counts as a road trip.
I think it does. I think that qualifies as a road trip.
It was great. The Voodoo Donuts had the peach fritter back for one weekend only, and we happened to be in the correct state. Sales tax free touristy donuts, everybody.
I do not like peach donuts, Sam I am.
Wait, you've had a peach donut, but you don't like it?
So, as you know, Voodoo Donuts in Portland, for a while, for the first 5 or 6 years they were open, people, every time you went to Portland, you couldn't escape them. They'd shoot 12 donuts at you.
Everybody you see downtown carrying this comically pink box like they're going to get it back to their hotel room and eat 12 of these 6,000 calorie Captain Crunch donuts.
And, you know, we would be playing shows and the local promoter would be like, oh my God, you're not going to believe it. Like, we got you. Like, you know, it's always what you want backstage is like some bottled water, some ham and cheese. I want peanut M&Ms.
You don't want a fritter the size of a catcher's mitt?
No. And there would always be this box of what, because they always assume that you've never heard of it before, even though you play Portland 14 times a year. It's like, oh, great. And I open a box of donuts, and what I want is a chocolate donut.
I don't think they even make it.
And it's like, oh, don't you want this donut that's like salamander flavored?
This one has Cocoa Puffs. Yeah. This one has Tang.
No, I don't want any of those. And so, but then you feel guilty. There's a box with, as you say, 50,000 calories worth of gluten and sugar.
Some of them costing $4 to $5 each.
Yeah, and it's like, and then there's the line around the block, and we used to play at Burbati's Pan, which was right there, and you had to like move your amps through this line of tourists waiting to eat a Cocoa Puffs flavored donut.
They're all made with ingredients that really are shelf stable for hundreds of years. Yeah. That's the beauty of Voodoo Donuts.
I don't mean to be curmudgeon about Voodoo Donuts. I'm very happy. I know that they are.
Well, no actual Portlandites are going to be mad because they know it's tourist stuff.
Well, but it's like they represent 15% of the Portland economy.
John and I go to Blue Star Donuts. We prefer your.
Thank you.
We know where the good donuts are at. But, you know, the one donut I liked there was the peach fritter because it was kind of a cinnamon tasting thing and it had like an inch of cream cheese on top, cream cheese frosting on top. And who doesn't like that? And they got rid of it. They got rid of the one donut I liked. But this weekend, for one weekend only, I saw on their social media, it was like, we're bringing back our most requested donut.
Ain't that the way?
Hey, buddy, why don't you guys make your most requested donut?
If it's most requested, that's a good sign.
I guess as soon as you bring it back, by definition, it won't be requested anymore.
I see.
Because,
True. Good point.
Because it'll just be in the rack. Nick and Rex, thank you so much for these delightful bespoke books. If you have items handy that you think John and I would like to talk about to make the show 5 minutes longer than it should be, you can send them to P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington, 98155.
Futurelings, from our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. We're not even entirely sure which side we're rooting for.
What are the two sides? Civilization and ruin.
Ruin, right. I guess that's it. Ruin.
Rooting for the blood wave.
Which one
as
are
it
you
comes out of the
for?
elevator.
Civilization or ruin, Ken?
I'm always in favor of civilization. I hate if you live with two kids, you hate the forces of entropy.
Oh, sure.
You hate the fact that laundry is knee deep everywhere and the things you fix crumble immediately. You want civilization to endure, just to show up your ungrateful kids.
There's a part of me that really wants to demonstrate that I can survive anything. And so I sometimes root for ruin just as a way to, I don't know, prove some toughness in myself. Like, oh, wouldn't you love to just have no food and no comfort and no and just be like at war with everyone all the time.
You've still got that pink box full of donuts from 6 years ago, and that'll last you for a few months.
When I think about it, no, I don't want to do that. Compared to like turning on Netflix at the end of the night with a bowl of ice cream and saying like, I wonder what dumb show to watch now.
It does seem a little bit like Lindsey Graham saying, well, of course I have an assault rifle. This is all going to melt down and I'm going to shoot my neighbors and constituents. But you don't really want it to. It's just a fantasy.
Yeah, right. It
would
seems
really
like
ruin your life if civilization ended in a lot of ways.
It's one more reason we need holodecks.
Yes.
Or that I should become a gamer. Maybe if I were a gamer, I would just blow up zombies and be fine.
You could do a fantasy role-playing game where you wander through the wasteland in your imagination.
My imagination.
Isn't that better than... What has better graphics than the human imagination?
I feel like I would just inhabit Adventure Time, and I would be like, hey, come on, Finn and Jake.
Let's all go save the princess.
Well, anyway,
I have no idea where you were.
That's where I was. Okay. Apparently, we hope and pray that this catastrophe we fear may never come.
Both of us.
But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, will have been our final word. So, if Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.